Hello and welcome to Behind the Music. I'm Kareem Bedder, and in this series I'm here to give you a composer's insight into the music you know and love. In today's video, as part of the ABRSM Piano Grade Edition, we will be going back to the beginning of the 20th century for a little light entertainment. That's right, we'll be looking at an arrangement of one of Scott Joplin's best known classics, The Entertainer. And I'm going to be showing you today how you could have written it too, step by step. So we're on the same page. This isn't the original version by Joplin, but the arranger has done a great job of taking the first half, simplifying it to make it easier for grade 3 level. Before we get going, if you want to hear a full playthrough, click the link in the description below. Otherwise, let's get started. The year is 1902, the dawn of a new century, and you're living out your mid-30s as the king of ragtime. You've long since left your teenage years of labouring the railways of Arkansas behind to live the life of a travelling musician, gigging wherever a black musician could in America at the time, as you made your home wherever you could find a piano. But since Chicago's World Fair, where you even played cornet in your band, ragtime's really taken off. Now you're settled in Missouri, and as well as getting some of your songs published off the back of your singing group, the Texas Medley Quartet, you've been playing dance halls with the Queen City Cornet Band, and performing solo at the clubs of Sedalia, the Queen City of the Prairies as it's also known. Your regular haunts are the Black 400 and the Williams Brothers Maple Leaf Club. And the music you play there has continued to be popular, publishing marches, waltzes, cakewalks, two-steps, and of course your Maple Leaf Rag. The last couple of years have been big ones, what with moving to the big city of St. Louis, and even getting married last year. Congratulations. Christmas is coming, reminding you of last year's blizzard, and now seems like the perfect time to write down some ideas for the new two-step you've been trying out in the clubs. You pull up a pew with your pen and paper. This one's going to be something special. You can feel it. To start with, we need a key and a time signature. Hopefully this tune will be another popular one, so we'll keep it nice and simple for anyone who wants to buy the sheet music to play at home. C major it is then. We're writing a two-step. This is a couple dance where the lead and the follow step together in a graceful walk, using opposite feet to glide along the dance floor. To fit the dance, it needs 2 beats in a bar, so let's use 2-2. The original is written as 2-4, but in this simplified version, we're avoiding semiquavers to make it a bit easier for newer pianists to read. Now that's decided, let's get an idea of the structure. The Maple Leaf Rag is a great example of the tried and tested format that's worked well for you before. AA, BB, A, CC, DD. So that's 4 different sections, most of them repeated, except for the recap of that A section in the middle. Some of your other rags add initial introduction and 1 or 2 small transitions between certain sections. For today's tune, let's use both. So we'll have an intro, AA, BB, A, CC, then a transition to end on DD. But this arrangement only goes through sections A and B without the repeats, so we won't cover the section C, D, or the transition for this video. Let's make a start on that A section then. It's pretty standard to stick to simple 4-bar phrases in ragtime, so let's see what we come up with to fit that pattern. For the first idea, we know we want a jaunty, syncopated feel to paint the picture of an entertainer dancing away on stage, so let's reinforce the home key with the note C. And if we use a jump up from another chord tone to get there, it might bring the jolly bounce we're after to the melody. Which chord tone though? G? Now that's missing something. What about the third of the chord? E. Yeah, that jump of a minor sixth is wide enough to give it a jaunty feel. And now, to create the ragged rhythm, we can move against the beat if we make that 2-note idea take up the space of 3 quavers. There we go, a nice cross rhythm that's already creating some syncopation. Now let's keep this tune going. This time, how about we mix it up with a jump down from the E and get a bit more faster paced quaver movement climbing back up. Great, so we can box in the C then to reinforce it a little bit more, approaching from below and then from above. Nice, let's repeat that first pattern and let's end it on a 5-1 chord progression, that's chords D to G in the key of G major, to land us neatly on G at the end of the phrase. For the melody, an arpeggio could work. Let's make it with the notes of a D7 chord. Oh, and let's go all the way up to add the ninth of the chord for a bit more tension. And then we want to land on that G chord we had at the end. So we can use a note from the chord of G. We could end on the note G or the note B. Both sound a little flat in terms of energy, so maybe a bigger jump will make it sound better. Let's do a big jump to D to make it sound more exciting and keep up that momentum we built so far. And to go in the opposite direction to oppose that downward motion of the first phrase, let's jump up so it's a bit more like a question. More like it. The next phrase will give us the answer to this question. But before we get there, let's add some lead-ins to the melody to make it flow a bit better. And let's use some semitones to create a chromatic lead-in for the main tune. And let's use similar lead-ins throughout the rest of the tune too to keep it moving. It also adds to the tension and helps to create that modern rag sound we're after. Now our melody's finally getting somewhere. Let's write the left hand for the first 8 bars of the A section. To back up the bouncy feel of the melody, a simple pa bass chord pattern can make the backbone of this accompaniment.
Oh, I don't think I want to hear that.
Too late. I've started dancing now. Once we've started, we can't stop.
And we don't have to break that pattern unless we want to make an exception. Maybe to stick in a walking bass line. But before we put in anything fancy, let's think of the overall bass line between the chords. For that, we can use the following notes of the C major scale. Let's go note 1, 5, 4, 3, 5, 5, 1. Here we're just outlining the key with the notes 1 and 5 and adding a little stepwise motion in the middle. Using the notes of the melody as a clue as to which chords will fit, we'll fill in the chords as C, C7 over G, F, C over E, C over G, G7, and C at the end. Let's break the part to clearly mark the end of the phrase. And let's end on 5, G, to bring us back to C, because for the next phrase, we'll start with the same bass line. Back to 1, 5, 4, 3. But remember we outlined D7 for the next bar in the arpeggio from the melody? So to fit in with that, we'll finish with a 2, 2, 5. D, D, G. We can break the pa pattern here again, this time using a bass line to bring us back to C. And speaking of bass lines, we could add a little run in the middle of the phrase. Let's first fill in the chords. And let's also fit in a bass line walking down to D using chromatic note E flat to get us there. And then we'll end on the chords we mentioned earlier, D7 to G. And that voice leading works really nicely at the end of the phrase there to move the G7 and the D7 here to the following chord by inwards moving semitones. Nice. Now we're getting a real shape to this. It's time to add a couple more 4-bar phrases to finish off this A section. Let's repeat the first 4 bars, but because it might be nice to use some higher notes on the piano to end the A section with something a little different, let's avoid that octave drop down to C from earlier, and we'll stick with middle C instead. That was easy. So, with only 4 bars to go until the end of the section, now would be a great chance to develop the idea from bar 3 of the first phrase in that melody, and see what we can make of that. We'll avoid the B, so we can hold off a little longer to build up a sense of anticipation for the G major chord we know is coming, and add an extra quaver at the end of the bar to keep things moving. Starting to sound like our entertainer's getting out his jazz hands.
5, 6, 7, 8.
I don't even know what this is. Then if we play this over some different chords to build tension, we can release that tension by ending with the original version. All of this an octave higher than the original idea. Great, and let's lead in with just a couple of solitary high notes to kick off the beginning of the phrase. And we're nearly there for section A, just the accompaniment to work out before we move on to section B. Let's think about the bass notes. Firstly, we can put them an octave higher than before to keep it light, to follow what that melody's doing. Now let's find the right notes. We can create a chromatic line to lead down to G, that's chord 5, for the third bar. If we start on C, jump up to the flat 7, B flat, giving us 1, flat 7, 6, flat 6, 5, and add 5-1 to the end. 5-1. And we need some chords to go with that bass line. So C, C7, which is the dominant seventh of F, so that leads on nicely. And then we can go down to F minor, just changing the third of the chord from an A to an A flat. Last of all, we can use the G to have an inversion of C, then G7 and C. That's the A section. Now on to the B section. Starting with the melody, we want something to contrast the theme from the A section. The first section sounded quite showy, almost like we were getting treated to the entertainer's best dance moves. Maybe now we can move on to something a bit more slapstick instead. So let's begin with a longer note to highlight the first beat of the bar. Then we can use lots of quavers to add movement and a tie in the middle of the bar to bring in some syncopation. In the first section, we highlighted the note C to establish the key. We'll stay in the same key, but now we can create a little more tension if we highlight note 5, G, a little more in the melody. Let's have G for all the long notes then to help it stand out, and we can fill out the rest of the melody using a few common melodic patterns. We can use an auxiliary note to go above and back to our G, some chromatic runs to lead up to G, some repetition, arpeggios as well in the key, and scalic patterns going up and down the notes of the scale. And let's reinforce that G again at the end by jumping down a fifth. It's a nice nod to that jumpy feel of the minor 6 we had right at the beginning. With the repetition of that lead up to G at the start of the phrase, it almost sounds like the build up to some clowning gaff. Maybe the entertainer's pretending that he's locked himself out of his apartment and he's trying to climb a ladder to get back in. If he is, it sounds like he keeps having to reset it because he's not having much luck. What do you imagine he's doing? Let me know in the comments below. So that's our first 4-bar phrase. Time to add some chords to go with it. To contrast the more frequent chord changes of the first section, let's drag out the chord C for the first 2 bars, using a few inversions to keep the bass line from being totally static. Like before, the C7 at the end there will lead us strongly onto the chord F. And from there, we can move to chord 1 via an F minor. This major chord 4 to minor chord 4 progression gives us a very gentle lead back to chord 1. And we can do that landing with an pa bass chord pattern to give us. Back to the melody, we can repeat the beginning again for the start of the next phrase, with a little lead in to have a scalic approach of the G from above and from below. Thinking ahead for choosing which chord we'll need at the end of this new line we're moving to, let's aim to end the line on chord 5 on G to take us back to the start of the section so that we can make the most of this new theme. To do that, let's use a common cadence. That's a fancy word for a 2-chord progression that normally comes at the end of a phrase. And we'll use the same one we used at the end of section A. That 1C, that's the second inversion of chord 1, 5-7, and then 1. So that will give us G over D, D7 to G, and we'll fit in a chromatic bass line to join the C over E to the G over D. And we can use a scalic bass line to lead us down from the last G to the start of the next line again on C. Time to fill out the melody. Is our entertainer going to fall off just yet? Why don't we make it seem like he's getting really close to his goal, building up the anticipation for the audience that see some kind of gaff coming from a mile off? We'll start the same then. But let's add a bit more excitement in the third bar to paint that picture, to throw our entertainer slightly off balance. We can add a bit more syncopation when the harmony deviates from what we had before and highlight it with some 2-note chords in the right hand. Here, thirds might work quite nicely just to fill out that G chord. And let's have a chromatic lead into those. Great, now if we follow those thirds with a little anticipation of the next chord, that'll make it more interesting, and we can rack up the drama by suspending the sixth above D major to create a slight melodic tension against the harmony before we resolve it back down to the chord tones by following the arpeggio of D major. So here's that sixth, B, and then our normal arpeggio. And then let's mirror what we did at the end of the previous phrase to jump up to G at the end instead of jumping down. Nice. Only 2 phrases left. Time to reset the ladder. He's confident he can do it this time. Let's repeat the first phrase to illustrate that idea. But use the last bar to bring us back onto C in the melody as a sign that we're coming to a close soon. Now that F, F minor, C over E chords we looked at from the first phrase of the section doesn't sound very final, so we can modify it here to lead us into a comic finale. Let's create some momentum by adding the 7th to C7 to propel us forward to the start of the final phrase that we can begin on an F chord. Much better. Instead of the weaker ending following F with F minor, let's crank up the tension again using a diminished chord. If we go with F sharp diminished 7th, that leads the bass up chromatically to the note 5, G, which we'll need for a big perfect cadence at the end. That G will enable us to use another 1C, 5-7, 1 to finish, and we can even stick in a secondary dominant, D7, to lead to the G7 for extra oomph. Speaking of which, we'll break the umpar pattern for this ending, hammering home the harmonies with full chords until just at the end, where we'll use a similar ending as we did in section A. And for the melody, we'll just play with similar rhythms and melodic shapes that we've used already in this section, picking out the notes from the chords. The entertainer's going to try for one last push so we can really keep the quavers moving in the second bar of the phrase. Will he make it? For the end of the last 2 bars, we want a big ending whatever happens. So let's recycle the syncopated rhythmic idea from the second phrase in the end of the penultimate bar. Da da da. And use the same chord tension, the 6th above the chord, this time without preparing it. And we end up with the same anticipation of the final chord. Great. Now let's reinforce that in the falling bass as, just before our clown makes it, he falls on his backside and the curtains close. Sounded great. We've got a 16-bar A section, a 16-bar B section. To top it off, let's rewind to the start of the show when our fresh-faced entertainer was just running out onto the stage by adding another 4 bars as a neat little intro. We want it to feel like part of the same piece of music, not just an afterthought, so let's pinch the rhythm from bar 3. And since the majority of the piece uses that umpar to fill out the bass and chords, let's contrast that by just starting high and creating a pattern that can sweep all the way down to introduce the bass, landing on a G, chord 5. That's going to give us a strong transition into the key C major. In fact, let's hint at the chord of G in the overall melodic pattern we're using for the intro to give it a bit more tension. And to make it a bit different from our original idea from bar 3, let's invert that shape of this melodic idea by changing each rising interval to a descending one, and vice versa. Nice, and we'll repeat it down an octave each time. with a little chromatic fill to begin the 4th bar on G. And the final touch, a loud G to bounce off to announce the main melody. And we made it. What a show. The audience was in awe, they were laughing, I'm sure there were even a few tears in there. But
that's all, folks.
And there it is, an easier version of one of Joplin's best known classics. Anyone for a quick 2-step? If you'd like to hear the finished piece, click the link in the description below for a full rendition. Thank you again for watching. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Behind the Music. If you did and you'd like to see more like this, then please leave a like, share with a friend, comment down below, and if you want to make sure you don't miss any future videos, why not hit that subscribe button and bell icon to make sure you're notified whenever I post a new one. Thank you for watching, and until next time, don't just have a good one, make it a masterpiece. See you in the next video.